Hey folks, welcome to the second series of Flow-MER Fridays, the webinar series as part of the Flow-MER project. I'm Ross Thompson, for those of you who haven't run into me before, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters of the Murray Darling Basin, to recognise their unique ability to care for country, their ongoing deep spiritual connection to country. And I'd like to express my respect for elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the fact that their knowledge and wisdom is an ongoing part of managing these special places. As a Flow-MER team, we are genuinely committed to engaging and partnering with traditional owners and Aboriginal communities to support the protection of country. And in particular today, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us meet, but also the 7 selected areas where Flow-MER research is focused. I've already introduced myself. I'm Ross Thompson. I lead the research component of the Flow-MER Basin Scale project. Emily Barber, who is currently on leave, lucky thing, leads the evaluation component. So Emily at CSIRO and myself at University of Canberra. This project is the product of so very many people's hard work and intellectual capital, and we have a set of partners who are working with us to deliver this program. Charles Sturt University, University of New England, Deakin University, SARDI in South Australia, New South Wales Fisheries, Arthur Rylah Institute in Victoria, Brooks Ecology and Technology up in, all over the place really, and the Australian River Restoration Centre, who partners with us in delivering these webinars and all of our communication engagement. The Flow-MER program, for those of you who haven't encountered it before, is based on 2 major components. One is the 7 selected areas where monitoring takes place, and that's managed by different teams in each of those selected areas. And then the basin scale integration program, because the basin plan requires us to report on environmental water at basin scale. The basin scale program is about integrating together all of the outputs from the selected areas and creating that scale of reporting. These projects obviously have a history. The research component, the piece that I'm leading, draws heavily on the UCA program, which finished in 2019. The evaluation component is essentially a continuation of the Elton program that completed in 2020. If you're interested in more about how all this works and how it all fits together, the Flow-MER Basin Scale Evaluation and Research Plan is your go-to document. That's available through the TUO website. If you do struggle to find it, feel free to reach out and I'm happy to send you a link to where that document sits. So the Flow-MER webinar program, this is our second batch of Flow-MER webinars, and initially we really set them up to facilitate the sharing of knowledge at all scales, researchers, water managers, local engagement officers, interested parties. But also to allow and encourage communication between selected area researchers and the basin scale team, and of course across agencies. We're going to add to that, I think, particularly in this second webinar series, the real focus on trying to enable and support adaptive management. And so one of the features of the second webinar series is that each of the presentations has a TUO co-author who will be presenting part of it. And that's really to provide that line of sight from the research or the evaluation outcomes that we're talking about and the actual management on the ground. All of these presentations are, of course, recorded. They're available through the Flow-MER website, and you should feel free to pass the links on to other people who are interested, or, you know, just on a quiet, rainy Tuesday night, sit down with some popcorn and watch back through some of them. So today, I want to talk about resilience. And resilience is a word which is thrown around a lot in management and in water management in particular. And we're often told that what we're seeking to do is to manage for resilience. And often the conversation doesn't go a lot more than that, a lot further than that. So what I want to think about today is a little bit more in depth around the what, the why, and the how. I'm going to talk about more of the theoretical and conceptual context for that. And then Nerida Sloan from TUO is going to talk about a particular case study which illustrates some of those concepts really nicely. So she'll be talking about the Macquarie Marshes. I've already introduced myself, but Nerida, some of you may not have encountered before. Nerida's from the Commonwealth Environment and Water Office, and she's Assistant Director of the Northern Basin Delivery Section And as I said, she's going to be talking in particular about the Macquarie Marshes, which is, of course, of great interest to this group because as it's not one of the 7 selected areas within the Flow-MER program, we haven't heard about as much about Macquarie as we might wish to. So it's a great opportunity today to hear about another site. So resilience, the what, the why, and the how. So what is resilience? It's a word which is thrown around a lot, but not always defined with any particular rigor. So if we accept the fact that ecological systems are constantly being disturbed by lots of different forces, and those may include local scale factors or regional scale factors. And so here is a simple hydrograph from the Murray Darling Basin, and you can see here the millennium drought, prolonged period of extreme disturbance, very, very dry conditions, but then broken by some of the wettest years on record, very, very wet conditions, also a disturbance in their own right. So how do ecological systems respond to that disturbance? Well, if we think of something about ecological condition, an ecological condition here could mean lots of different things. It might mean the condition of fish and their readiness to spawn. It might mean vegetative cover of understory plants, or it might mean canopy condition of river red gum forest. So ecological condition from low to high, these are images taken by my colleague Sean Cunningham, showing condition of river red gum canopy. So ecological condition on one axis, time on another. If we're in the good times, there's plenty of water around, then we tend to have pretty good ecological condition. As we move into the worst times though, when we perhaps haven't got as much water in the landscape, maybe it is the start of the millennium drought, maybe it's a long dry period within a year, maybe it's a heat wave. That condition will initially start to decline, and the shape of that decline will depend very much on what sort of ecological condition you're looking at. But in the case of river red gums, initially they'll sort of be okay, then they'll start to drop leaves, they'll start to drop small branches, then they'll start to drop large branches, and we get these sort of stag trees left with very little canopy. When water comes back, either because we provide an environmental flow or climatic conditions change, then that system recovers. And so we would get a restoration of that condition over some time. And this is resilience. And resilience refers to the ability of an ecosystem to tolerate disturbance and then to recover after disturbance. And there are 2 quite different components to that, and that's recognized in the original definition of ecological resilience. One of them is about the time required for an ecosystem to recover. So that's sometimes referred to as engineering resilience. It's basically a system has been changed, it's been subject to disturbance, and then it's going to recover. There's a second component to resilience, however, and that second component to resilience is the ability of the system to not change when it is affected by disturbance. Now, this is sometimes referred to as resistance, or even more confusingly, as latitude. But there are 2 components to resilience. One is the ability to respond, to recover, and the other is ability to resist change in the first place. So if we go back to our graph of river red gum condition, there's 2 components of resilience we're seeing here. One is that resistance component. So initially, as things get dry, the tree will have the ability to extend down into groundwater. It'll have energy reserves which are stored. So it will be able to keep its condition up, even though the actual environmental conditions aren't very good anymore. Ultimately, it'll cease to be able to do that, and then it will go into a decline. When the good times come back, that's when it's exhibiting its resilience, the ability to bounce back up to its previous state after change. So those 2 components are worth thinking about, because we have different species that have different components of resistance, or the ability to resist change, and resilience, the ability to bounce back. Now I have to insert a parenthesis here, and it's a big parenthesis, and that is around other uses of the term resilience. And resilience, somewhat confusingly and vaguely irritatingly, is used in other disciplines in quite a different way. And lots of you, I think, will have heard about social resilience. In fact, I would argue that the term resilience is most often used in discussions around the Murray Darling Basin Plan around social resilience. Social resilience is the ability of social entities to tolerate, absorb, and adjust to threats. It's most similar to resistance. So how do all of the social connections within a system maintain themselves in the face of a disturbance? So maybe there is a change in the patterns of the workforce as a response to water reform. So there's less people working in the cotton industry. How does the community maintain itself? How does it maintain its social connections? How does it make sure that it has a healthy primary school? All of those things are part of social resilience. Economists always make me sob a little bit, but in this particular case, they make me sob a lot because they've used the word resilience in an even different way. And economic resilience is the community's ability to foresee and then change in response to changing conditions to their advantage. So they end out ahead of the game, not just back to where they were. And so that's actually most similar to something like ecological succession or adaptation. But the point is here, it's really quite a different use of the term resilience. So ecological resilience is the ability to resist change and rebound. Social resilience is the ability to absorb change and maintain structure. And economic resilience is the ability to adapt to change and improve. And this is the sort of stuff why people hate academics, because we don't use words in very consistent ways. But nonetheless, it's important that we all are sort of aware of those differences in terms. We're talking about ecological resilience today, but I will relate back to social and economic resilience a little bit later on. Close parentheses. So we have two components of resilience here. One, resilience is the time required for an ecosystem to recover after a disturbance, and the second is the ability of it to maintain its state when it's affected by disturbance. And that state could be all sorts of things. It could be fish population size. It could be vegetation cover. It could be patterns of primary production. All of those things are ecological states that we might seek to manage for. So why does resilience matter? Well, resilience matters perhaps in the most sort of trite way because the Basin Plan tells us it does. And so within the Basin Plan, we are committed to generating ecosystems that are resilient to climate change and other risks. And so because of that, that then flows through the basin watering strategy and into a set of outcomes within the QO outcomes framework, which are around managing for and generating ecosystem resilience. And so that focuses largely on refugia and also on ecosystem recovery. That perhaps doesn't penetrate quite so deeply into the foundation reports, which talk about how we're going to address, actually do those things. So resilience isn't such a feature in terms of the word within the foundation reports, but nonetheless, it's a profound part of all of these different components of our foundation work. So resilience matters, obviously, because legislation tells us it matters, but it also matters really profoundly in terms of managing systems. And that is because resilience determines the magnitude and timing of ecological responses to management interventions. I'll give you an example. So here we have a really simple example, golden perch. Golden perch swimming along, conditions aren't the best, so maybe they're sort of not spawning very much, not spawning at all, and then we're able to provide them with environmental flow. Because of that environmental flow, that triggers spawning, and they're then able to spawn away. So the ecological condition goes from a system which doesn't support golden perch spawning to a system that does. And essentially, this is quite a simple case because if you've got fish, adult fish present in the system, we know we can make them spawn by providing flows at the right time of the year in the right amounts. And so golden perch condition does decline over dry times, but it doesn't decline very quickly. And usually they're pretty resilient. So they can respond very quickly when water returns. So this example, they're very resistant, they don't decline very fast, and they're very resilient. They come back when the flow comes back. There's some other examples though, and so the river red gum condition that I talked about before, river red gums, if things get dry, decline relatively slowly. They don't lose condition in the first few years, but once they do lose condition, then they start to lose condition quite precipitously. So they start to drop big limbs. And so then we've got a big decline in condition. Let's say we provide environmental flows to a river red gum habitat in order to restore them. They recover pretty slowly. So slow to decline initially, then a big decline, and then when we provide water, they recover again. So they're an example of a species which is quite resistant. It doesn't change very slowly, but it's relatively slow in terms of resilience. It only recovers its condition relatively slowly because they've got to grow back all those limbs and grow back that leaf litter. Frogs are sort of the classic case of things that change really fast. And so if we go into dry times, because they're basically limited by the amount of water in the environment quite directly, they decline pretty quickly in numbers. If we start to go into a dry phase, if you can provide water back into the environment, they can usually recover pretty fast. So frogs are a good example of something low resistance. They decline really quickly when things get dry, but they also bounce back pretty fast. And I couldn't stop myself using the word bounce back about frogs. I just had to do it. So we produced a paper a few years ago from my group when we were down at Monash, which is called Do Frogs Bounce? And if so, by how much? And what it basically showed is exactly what I just said, that if we look at records of frogs through time, you can see the Millennium Drought, they crashed very quickly and then they bounced back post-drought when water was back in the landscape. The second reason why resilience matters is that it guides us in what trajectories of change we can expect in these systems. Let me explain that because it probably isn't the most simple of concepts, but you can imagine that if we have a river red gum estate which is declining in condition due to something like climate change, and we know that's happening. So we can look across the basin and we can see that even if we ignore anything to do with water management, river red gums are declining because the climate is drying. Now, maybe we go into a drought and they decline more precipitously, so they get much worse. We might be able to provide environmental flows to try and get them to recover, but as we've said, they're slow to recover and they don't recover very much before they start being affected by climate change again, which causes ongoing decline. Maybe we provide some more water that allows them to recover a little bit more, but ultimately they're not getting back up to that ecological condition that they were before because climate change is slowly degrading their capacity to be in really good ecological condition. And you can imagine that in some places where the effects of climate change are particularly profound, that if you then had another drought, you might actually be getting a system where you're losing river red gums. And that is a significant concern across large amounts of the higher floodplain areas through the Murray Darling Basin. That climate change has driven the condition of these trees down slowly over time, meaning that ultimately intermittent droughts, even if we manage them and can get water to them, they will decline and be lost from parts of the system. I do apologise for the background noise. My university has decided that drilling a hole in the roof of my office is a really awesome idea. They're wrong. Okay, so if you are interested in this, there's been a definitive and particularly excellent paper produced on this issue around the way in which lags and legacies, long-term effects might actually affect the condition of ecological systems, where it does talk about some of those interactions between different species, their lifestyles, and the way in which climate change and flow modification might affect their condition. So that's what resilience is and why we should care. It's really important in terms of looking at ecological outcomes. It's also legislated. How can we manage for resilience? And I think this is the step that's probably too really taken. We need to think about actually in a real sense, talking to water managers, what can we actually do? So what actually determines the ability of a species or a population or a system to recover after it's been affected by disturbance? What affects whether they're resistant and can avoid changing in response to a drought or a dry time? And what determines their resilience, their ability to bounce back? Again, particularly definitive and excellent publication produced a couple of years ago, which tries to pull apart the things that actually drive resilience in ecosystems. 4 things that we know are important. One is simply the traits of the species involved, and I've already talked about that. River red gum, the fact that their life histories mean that they are going to be relatively slow to be affected by disturbance, relatively slow to recover from it. Something like Murray cod. Murray cod tend to be relatively resilient even to systems drying right down, and when water comes back, they breed and they're pretty happy. So the traits of the species involved are clearly important. Dispersal and connectivity to habitats in good condition. If parts of the habitat are declining and we lose species, the ability of that part to be the habitat to be resilient can be determined by whether it can be recolonized from other places. So obviously a piece of habitat which is affected by disturbance will recover more quickly if it's connected to habitats in good condition and that the species from those good condition habitats can recover. Food web structure, I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment in more detail, and then the presence of other stressors, and that's where Nerida in particular is going to talk about non-quarry marshes. So the traits of species involved. And I've talked about golden perch, the fact that golden perch really are sitting there waiting for these flow triggers. They're a good example of a species that is going to be reasonably resilient, providing you can keep condition in the adult fish and they're not just running out of habitat to live in. And so if that's true, then you really are managing for a system and a species that it is as simple as working out when do they need water, just add water at the right time and right place, and you'll get the response, and that species will be resilient. So for species which we know are resilient, then we can just add water. Dispersal and connectivity. If we have parts of the habitat that are refugia, that are quite resistant to the effects of change, then we can actually make our system more resilient if we can connect those refugia back to other parts of the landscape in the good times. And I think this is an area we're really moving into and thinking about a lot more. Where are the refuges in the habitat? Because for some species, all they need is good habitat somewhere in the system. A great example of that is waterbirds, and you'll all be aware of Heather McGuinness's waterbird work, where if parts of the system are in relatively poor condition, that doesn't matter to waterbirds because they can track to other parts of the system where they might be able to maintain their breeding. So it's only if you've got system-wide poor condition that they're not going to be able to persist in that system. Food web structure. I've talked a little bit about the fact that we can use flow cues to generate spawning in golden perch. And obviously when you spawn golden perch, you then generate these small things which are essentially eggs with tails. So little golden perch larvae, and then those golden perch larvae hopefully grow up to be recruits, juvenile fish, and then ultimately adult fish. Now we know that we are producing less juvenile fish than we would expect based on the amount of spawning activity we see. So we're generating spawning activity within the basin using environmental flows, but we're not always seeing those baby fish moving into their juvenile phase. And that's likely to be because of food web effects. So resources that the species requires when it's at those very young stages in order to be able to survive, grow, and move into those larger size classes. And so when we are managing for a particular species, we have to manage across its whole life cycle, and that includes all of its resources. So food web structure can be really important. So often we're managing flows for several parts of the food web. We're trying to generate productivity so we can generate zooplankton. We're trying to use flows to try and provoke spawning so that we get that zooplankton productivity coming together with those larval fish. They're able to then grow and move into the next stage of their life cycle. And then finally, resilience is determined by the presence of other stressors. So all systems are subject to what Sam Lake referred to in a famous paper years ago as multiple insults. So they're being affected by lots of different stressors. Now that can be a little bit depressing, but it actually gives us an opportunity as well, because when we're thinking about only flow as a way of creating resilience in systems, there are actually other management levers we can pull where we can look at multiple stresses, and that can then allow us to try and manage one of those stresses even when we can't manage flow specifically. A couple of examples of this. A few years ago, Jim Thompson and others did a study which showed that invertebrate communities persisted in the face of the millennium drought when they had better conditioned riparian forest. So basically more riparian trees shading the water, and that allowed them to be more resilient to the effect of climate. So two stresses going on there, land use change and climate change. If you manage the land use change, you can increase resilience in the face of climate change. So these systems are complex and there are lots of stresses going on. And so this is a great time to hand over to Nerida to talk about a real life example from the Macquarie Marshes, where there are a whole lot of stresses operating together that water managers are seeking to work with. So I'm going to pass over to Nerida.
Apologies. Need to unmute myself first. All right, I'll just check. You can see the slides.
We can see and hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ross. So I'm just going to give a bit of a case study about how water for the environment is used to support parts of the Macquarie marshes and how this might be helping wetland and species resilience in parts of those areas.
Nerida, it's Shuan here. Can you go to full slideshow? Because at the moment we've still got your side menu.
I did do that.
Okay, look, if it's going to cause a problem, then just keep going as you are. That's okay. It's just that we can see yeah.
Ross want to?
No, it's okay. You keep going. It's all right. It's better that you can control them. That's fine.
I've got it on my big screen.
Yeah, it's fine. We can see enough. That's no problem.
Okay, so the Macquarie, before it starts, I'd like to acknowledge that environmental water management in the Macquarie is a collaboration between New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and the Environment and the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office. And we have a lot of input from New South Wales Fisheries, New South Wales Parks and Wildlife, the Environmental Water Advisory Group and river operators. As Ross said, the Macquarie Marshes is not a selected area under the Flow-MER program. However, the findings from Flow-MER may help inform management at a broader suite of sites than just the selected areas. Monitoring the marshes is largely undertaken by DPIES, New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife, and I'd like to thank them for their ongoing collaboration and use of some of the photos and materials for this presentation. So the Macquarie Marshes is in northern New South Wales. It's northwest of Dubbo and water flows in a northwesterly direction and then joins up with the Barwon River. So the Macquarie Marshes is a really special place. It is a highly diverse wetland system. It's highly ecologically important and supports hundreds of plants and animal species, including threatened and migratory species. It is also an important site for large-scale colonial waterbird breeding and is highly culturally significant. And so parts of the marshes are recognised under the Ramsar Convention, and around 12% is managed as a nature reserve. So there are many threats and stresses that may affect the resilience of the marshes, including hydrological changes, changes in flooding frequency, duration, volumes to the marshes. And many of these have been occurring for a long time. Geomorphological changes such as incision and changed flow paths and diversions mean that water doesn't go where it used to go. Invasive species such as Lipia, which can outcompete native plants, pest species such as pigs, goats, cats, foxes, and carp that impact habitat, compete for resources, and predate on other animals. Fire, which depending on frequency and scale and severity can also affect parts of the marshes and their resilience. And climate change, which may further impact rainfall and hydrology and availability and exacerbate some of the other threats and stresses. All of these put pressures on the values and species in the marshes. So the Macquarie Marshes is the broader marshes covers an area of around 200,000 hectares and includes a variety of wetland types ranging from semi-permanent wetlands, lagoons and ephemeral wetlands. The frequency and duration of inundation are indication of the location of different types of wetland ecosystems, and they have different watering requirements. These inner areas in the blue through to the pink zones support a range of reed beds, lagoons, mixed marsh, water cooch, river redgum forest, river coober, and those systems require water annually or biannually. Large areas of the marshes floodplain in these orange, green and pale yellow areas receive water much less frequently, and they really need those large-scale floods from wet periods and dam spill events. And these areas are largely out of reach for environmental water management. So there is the question, are these areas more susceptible if those long-term flooding frequency changes? And how does that impact their resilience? This graph shows the last 10 years of flows at Marebone, which is upstream of the marshes. The blue is the tributary flows and the surplus flows, with the green being managed environmental water and the red regulated irrigation downstream of Marebone. So most of that regulated waters will be extracted for use. So as you can see, water for the environment has been delivered in every year except 2019, where there was no water available. I'd also like to point out that New South Wales has been delivering environmental water in the Macquarie for a long time prior to 2010. So water for the environment is often used to support those core wetland systems in those blue and pink zones, sometimes into the red. Depending on availability, conditions and constraints, water can reach 4,000 or 20,000, sometimes more in some years. So water for the environment is used to provide water between the floods. We're trying to support those wetland ecology and those processes and habitat in those core areas and build their resilience. By keeping those inner core areas wet, we're trying to keep them not wet all the time. We're trying to keep them in reasonable condition that can respond when there are better conditions and allow fish, frogs and water birds to spread. The timing and duration of deliveries is also important. So we're often trying to ensure that watering is long enough during the warmer months when things grow that enable insects, fish, frogs, birds, vegetation to complete their life cycles. So we're trying to support that future growth and that future population. Targeting duration can mean a compromise with the area inundated in years where there's less water available. So conditions and availability vary between years, from very wet to very dry and in between. Deliveries of water for the environment to the inner parts of the marshes have over time improved the extent and condition of wetland vegetation. It's resulted in expansion of reeds, water cooch, other wetland vegetation, such as river red gums in the inner areas. Supported widespread and successful breeding and recruitment of frog species, particularly flow-dependent species, except in the driest year in 2019. It's provided food and foraging habitat for birds and other species and supported water bird diversity and maintained water bird breeding habitat. And depending on the year, we've supported small-scale water bird breeding, but also the completion of large-scale colonial water bird breeding in those years when it's occurred. And continued to provide that lateral and longitudinal connectivity between the river and the marshes, floodplain and the Barwon. In areas that have been watered, wetland vegetation, frogs and birds have been observed to respond quickly and well when there's rainfall and natural inflows. Without environmental water, there would have been very little flows into the marshes in some years. In more recent years, the marshes has experienced very dry conditions. During prolonged drought conditions, flows to the northern reedbed ceased for over 10 months and soil moisture levels were low. In October 2019, approximately 86% of the northern reedbed and some river red gum woodland was burnt following a lightning strike. Fires are not unusual in the marshes, and reedbeds can withstand low intensity fires, particularly when that soil moisture is high, as it often is in a marsh system. However, severe hot fires that damage the underground stems may impact the ability of reeds to recover. Luckily, in 2019, the burnt reeds sprouted immediately after the fire and reached approximately 30 centimetres in height within a month. And they do this using the energy stored in their rhizomes or their underground stems. So it shows that their capacity, that their resilience to sprout, even during a record drought, 10 to 12 months since water last flowed into the marshes. They do need support though, because growth then stalls while conditions remain dry. Late summer, autumn rainfall in 2020 helped the reeds and other areas of the marshes to start growing again. New South Wales and Commonwealth environmental water was delivered in spring to maintain inundation and soil moisture for long enough to help those reeds to grow and replenish their rhizomes for future growth, among a whole range of other environmental outcomes being targeted. But by November, the reed response had been very positive, but additional regrowth was needed. So water deliveries continued at low flow rates throughout summer to maintain soil moisture and continue that recovery. So large areas of the reed bed have significantly improved in condition and stand between 2 and 3 metres high now. But more flows will be needed in future to continue that recovery and rebuild that resilience in those reed systems. We've also observed good response in other vegetation, frog breeding and recruitment, and waterbird richness following watering after those really, really dry conditions. Part of that resilience has been built over time through targeted deliveries of water for the environment to the inner or core areas of the marshes. There are always ongoing challenges though. So we've already mentioned that large areas of various wetland systems cannot always be reached with environmental water. We're often making trade-offs between water availability between years and trying to do multi-year watering. There may be trade-offs between target areas and duration. There are gaps in our understanding of these systems. How well do we understand resilience and thresholds of change for different species and ecosystems there? And what is the impact of multiple stresses acting at these sites? And climate change. What are the implications of climate change for the ecology and resilience of these important wetlands and the role of environmental water management? And so we're hoping that the work under the Flow-MER program will help address some of these questions and improve our understanding of resilience, its implications, and also suggestions for management. Thanks, Ross. Back to you.
Thank you very much. And so what we just heard in a real world case is the fact that we're dealing with systems that are really complex and subject to multiple stresses. And the fire example is a very good one. These systems can cope with a degree of fire. They have resilience, but we need to assist that resilience by providing environmental water. And we need to understand how long that resilience will be maintained, particularly if things like fire frequencies start to change. So if we do get more regular fire through these ecosystems, are we going to need to water more regularly in order to counter that effect? So those sort of understanding are critical to resilience and resilience management. And right through the system, we know that there are other factors which are affecting outcomes to environmental water and affecting resilience. And there's some complexity there. This is some work that was done, currently unpublished, but in preparation using the Sustainable Rivers Audit and Southern Basin Fish Survey work. And what this did was look at fish populations through the end of the millennium drought and then through to post-drought. And the trajectories of change between species were really quite different. So European carp, it turns out, are extremely resilient. So when water came back into the system, they bounced really, really fast and high and back to their previous levels. But some things we really care about, like southern pygmy perch, they just had a little bounce. They were a little bit resilient, they recovered, and then they continued to decline. And in some cases, these declines are actually because of interactions with the invasive species. Invasive species, by definition, tend to be quite resilient. And so when we do have systems that are subject to restoration and watering, we have to be aware of the fact that in some cases we won't see the response we desire, because of interactions with other stressors. So we've heard about fire from the Macquarie marshes, but invasive species are another one. So the management implications are that we can improve resilience of systems, but we need to be aware of what the processes are that maintain that resilience and what the processes are of the disturbances that affect ecological returns and affect resilience. So I'm going to go back now to the research projects that are under the Flow-MER Evaluation and Research Program, and I'm going to just map some of those research projects to the sort of concepts that we've been talking about today. Right through a whole group of our projects, so there's a flow ecology relationship program, which is led by Daniel Stratford, resilience and condition project, which is led by Shane Brooks and Joe Bennett, and the non-woody vegetation work, which is with Sherry Campbell, Fiona Dyer, and Tanya Moody. All of those projects have a component of them of trying to understand condition and the way in which condition changes through time. And so there's a lot of work going on looking at the relationship between hydrology, return times of watering, and the way that that affects tree condition and vegetation condition. So that work's ongoing, and it has at its heart the idea of trying to understand resilience when flow is provided. So it's very much investigating the species level natures of the changes. So what is it about traits of particular species that allow them to respond or maintain condition in the face of dry times and recover condition when water is put back into a system? Another project which deals with key concepts of resilience is the fish movement work that Jason Team and Brendan Sampati do. So you'll be aware of the work that they've presented in previous webinars around the movement of fish through the system and understanding where barriers to movement are. And these are critical where we know that we have systems that are affected by disturbance, the Menindee Lakes, for example, and the ability of fish to get from neighbouring higher quality habitat and recolonise those areas. And this really gets to that second idea of how resilience can be supported, which is through maintaining patterns of connectivity and dispersal between habitats. You again will be aware of the work by Heather McGuinness, which is very similar. It helps us understand what scale we have to manage at in order to maintain resilience in waterbird populations. So if there are parts of the system that are very dry, do we need to water other parts of the system in order to provide opportunities for waterbird breeding? So again, that's about dispersal and connectivity. Waterbirds are moving at such large scales through the landscape that they can track water at almost a whole of basin scale. Refugia and the availability of refugia is some work which is going on led by Joe Bennett, which is about trying to understand where refuges are. And I know many of the people on this webinar have contributed to Joe's work, and that she's trying to get a sense of how we've mapped refugia, the persistence of those refugia, the connectivity through space and time, and then also what the food web structures are within those refugia that allow them to function. And so ultimately what we hope to do is to be able to understand what the various drivers are that allow populations to be resilient. And so there is a bioenergetic work which is being done by, led by James Hitchcock, where he is trying to understand if we want resilient golden perch populations, how can we not only use flow to generate breeding events, but also use flow to generate the resources that allow larval fish to then recruit through to those later life stages. Now, obviously, the final way in which we can generate resilience is by thinking at a system scale about all of the drivers that are present within these systems. And that includes climate change, it includes land use change, it includes invasive species. And I think a challenge for the next generation of environmental flow research and management is going to be getting a much stronger understanding of what those other non-flow drivers are doing in these ecosystems and how we can work with them, or in some case counter the effects of those disturbances using flow management, or whether we actually need to focus on managing other stresses and other drivers so that we can get the maximum ecological response from environmental flow delivery. So to pull this together to some implications for management. We talk about implementing resilience thinking, and resilience thinking to me is really about asking the right questions. What are we managing for? What is its condition? Are the components that we're managing for naturally resilient? In which case it may well be that they will survive dry times. Is it that once the resistance of that system is overcome, that they're very hard to recover, in which case we need to water early. We need to make sure that we're getting water to them so they can maintain their condition rather than waiting for their condition to be able to recover. And trying to seek what parts of the landscape are critical to resilience. Now, this is crucial thinking because, as Nerida has said, our ability to deliver water across the landscape is by no means even. We can only water particular parts of the landscape. In dry times, that question is even more profound. So which parts of the landscape are critical refugia to ensure the resilience of the landscape when water comes back? When thinking about resilience, we need to understand what the natural traits are of our species, and that determines whether we need to be maintaining them in good condition or relying on their natural resilience to recover later. Where systems are resilient, and so there's a good example today from the Quarry Marshes, resilience in the face of fire, how long will that resilience last? Do we need to have 3 or 4 good wet years before they'll be able to survive another fire? What is the ability of systems to rebuild their resilience after disturbance? Are there components of the ecosystem that will not be resilient regardless of what we do with environmental water? It's a difficult question for us to face, but there are nonetheless parts of our ecosystems that are in long-term decline, and that even with environmental water, we may not be able to maintain them in the condition that we're seeking. And finally, as I've already said, the fact that there are a number of non-water management factors affecting resilience that can limit the response we see to environmental flows. And so we need to understand those and understand where they need to be managed before water if they are the main limiting factor on condition. And of course, the final challenge is really going back to the economic and social resilience that I talked about in the parentheses early on. We are moving much more into a world where we are trying to understand the interactions between social, economic, and ecological features, and resilience thinking has been very active in that space. So bringing together an understanding of resilience, how do we provide environmental water that maintains environmental resilience, but how do we also understand what effect we're having on social resilience and economic resilience? So that is a big picture endeavour, but nonetheless is where we are moving towards with respect to natural resource management more broadly. There's lots of cool tools like this horrifying looking diagram that I can imagine the look on Siobhan's face as I put it up. But the sort of network tools that exist now where we can actually build networks and look at interactions between things like social resilience and environmental resilience. You may be aware of the work that's being done by Jackie Shermer around understanding social resilience within the Murray Darling Basin and understanding that really that environmental resilience is affecting people's social resilience. If they see a degrading environment, that actually makes them feel worse about the area they live in. And that's a really critical feedback that we haven't always thought about in the past. So those sort of feedbacks is where we're really moving, a system thinking that allows us to integrate our ecological understanding into a broader social and economic context.